I'm a 27-year-old guy, and for most of my life, my relationship with my mom, Julia 50F, has been complicated. It didn't start that way, though. When I was a kid, it was just me and her against the world. My dad wasn't in the picture, but I didn't feel like I was missing out. Mom was my hero, fun, hardworking, and always making sure I never felt alone. Life wasn't perfect, but it was happy. Things started to change when I was around 12. That's when Rick, now 52M, came into the picture. At first, he seemed okay. Mom was happier than I'd seen her in years, and I wanted her to be happy. But as time went on, Rick's personality started showing through. He was controlling, opinionated, and had this way of turning every disagreement into a personal attack. It didn't take long for me to realize that my place in the family dynamic was shifting. Rick didn't like kids who talked back or had opinions of their own, and I had plenty of both. By the time I was a teenager, he was finding fault with everything I did. If I didn't do a chore exactly the way he wanted, I was lazy. If I tried to stand up for myself, I was disrespectful. It didn't help that my mom started taking his side in every argument, no matter how unfair or ridiculous his demands were. I remember walking on eggshells constantly, afraid that the smallest thing would set him off. It wasn't just the big arguments that made things hard, it was the little, everyday moments that wore me down. Like the time I came home late from studying at a friend's house, and Rick made it into a federal offense. Or when I saved up money from part-time jobs for a car, only for Rick to casually suggest that he use it instead because he needed it more. The big blow-up happened when I was 18. Rick wanted the car I had bought with my own savings, and when I refused, things escalated fast. Words were exchanged, voices were raised, and my mom ended up siding with him. She told me that if I couldn't respect Rick, then maybe I shouldn't live under their roof. The next thing I knew, I was packing a duffel bag with whatever I could carry and heading out the door. I crashed at a friend's house for a while, trying to figure out what to do next. Starting out on my own was rough. I worked minimum wage jobs, scraped together enough for community college classes, and slept on couches whenever I could. Mom and I kept in touch here and there, but it was always me reaching out. The conversations were short and awkward, like talking to a distant relative instead of the woman who had raised me. When I asked for help with college, just a co-sign on a loan, not even money, she and Rick shot me down immediately. They told me I needed to learn responsibility and figure it out myself. That hurt, but at the same time, it lit a fire under me. I worked hard, finished school, and by my mid-20s, I had built a stable career in tech. I had a good job, my own apartment, and enough savings to feel secure for the first time in years. Meanwhile, my mom and Rick seemed to be living their best lives. They posted pictures on social media of vacations, fancy dinners, and their perfect family. They never reached out unless it was a quick happy birthday text or something equally surface level. I had long since given up on the idea of having a close relationship with them. Then, 2 months ago, I got a message from my mom out of the blue. She wanted to catch up and asked if we could have a phone call. I was suspicious. After years of minimal contact, why now? But a part of me hoped this was her way of trying to mend things. Maybe she'd finally realized how much we had drifted apart and wanted to fix it. I wasn't ready to let my guard down completely, but I agreed to the call. At first, the conversation was polite, even pleasant. She asked about my life, my job, and my friends, but there was something off about the way she kept steering the conversation back to my career and how successful I had become. Then came the bombshell. She told me that Rick had lost his job, their savings were running out, and they were struggling to keep up with their bills. She didn't outright ask for money, but it was clear where the conversation was headed. She mentioned how proud she was of everything I had accomplished and how she knew I would always be there for family. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. After everything that had happened, the fights, the years of feeling abandoned, she was coming to me for help. I didn't give her an answer right away. I told her I needed to think about it and ended the call as quickly as I could. Now, I'm left wondering what to do. Part of me wants to help because she's my mom, but the other part can't ignore the years of neglect and the fact that Rick, the man who made my life miserable, is still in the picture. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I have the upper hand, but I'm not sure if I want to use it. All I know is, this isn't going to end here. Update 1. After that first call with my mom, I didn't reply to her for a while. I needed space to think, but it didn't take her long to follow up. About a week later, she called again. This time, she dove straight into the details of their financial situation. Rick, it turned out, had lost his job several months ago due to downsizing at his company. She mentioned they'd been living off their savings since then, but the money was running out faster than they'd expected. They were behind on some bills, and things weren't looking good. She talked about how Rick had been trying to find work but wasn't having much luck because of his age. It all felt rehearsed, like she'd spent time practicing exactly how to say it. Then came the pitch. She said that, as her successful son, I was in a good position to help the family out, just temporarily, until Rick found a new job. She didn't outright ask for money, but the implication was crystal clear. She went on about how family should stick together in tough times and how proud she was of me for making something of myself. The whole thing felt like a performance, but I stayed quiet and let her talk. When she finally paused, I brought up the past. I reminded her how, when I was struggling, she and Rick hadn't lifted a finger to help. I mentioned how they refused to co-sign my college loans and how I had to hustle to get by on my own. Her response? She brushed it off, saying she'd done what she thought was best for me at the time, and that I had turned out fine because of it. It was like she thought that years of neglect could be wiped away with a casual shrug. Hearing her talk like that brought up a lot of resentment I hadn't realized was still there. I told her I needed time to think about everything, but I couldn't make any promises. She sounded disappointed but didn't push back. At least not right then. After the call, I started asking friends for advice. Most of them said the same thing: don't do it. They reminded me of how toxic my relationship with my mom and Rick had been and pointed out that it wasn't my responsibility to fix their problems. A couple of them even suggested I post about the situation on Reddit, so I decided to give it a shot. I wrote a post detailing the whole story, from the happy childhood to getting kicked out and now this sudden request for money. The responses were overwhelming. Thousands of people weighed in, and the vast majority agreed I didn't owe them anything. Some even shared similar experiences with estranged parents suddenly coming back into their lives when they needed something. It was reassuring to see so many people validate my feelings. About 2 weeks after that first follow-up call, my mom reached out again. This time Rick was on the line too. I wasn't thrilled about it, but I figured I'd hear them out. Rick jumped in almost immediately, saying he had always tried to help me grow into a responsible adult, and that now it was my turn to step up and support the family. He framed it like he had done me some huge favor by being hard on me when I was younger. It was absurd. I calmly explained that while I was doing okay financially, I wasn't in a position to fund their household. Rick got defensive, saying I was abandoning my family and accusing me of being selfish. My mom tried to play peacemaker but ended up turning on the waterworks, saying she didn't understand how I could let them struggle after everything she had done for me as a single mom. She kept bringing up the sacrifices she made when I was a kid, like working long hours and skipping vacations. It was hard to sit through, but I stayed firm. I told them I wasn't comfortable giving them money and that I needed more time to process everything. Rick was fuming, and my mom was crying, but I ended the call before things could escalate further. After that, I went back to Reddit and posted an update. Once again, the comments poured in. A lot of people praised me for holding my ground and warned me not to cave under the pressure. Some even suggested I cut contact entirely, but I wasn't ready to go that far yet. The whole situation left me feeling drained, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over. My mom and Rick weren't going to back off easily, and I needed to figure out how to handle whatever came next. For now, though, I was standing my ground. If they wanted to guilt trip or manipulate me into helping them, they were going to be disappointed. Update 2. Not long after the last phone call, Rick found a new way to escalate things. He started texting me directly. One morning, I woke up to a long message where he called me selfish and accused me of letting my mom suffer because of my pettiness. He went on about how he had always tried to guide me and help me grow into a better person, and now I was throwing it all back in his face. It was a lot of words for someone who hadn't reached out to me in years unless it was to demand something. Later that day, my mom called. She apologized for Rick's tone, claiming he was just stressed and didn't mean everything he said. It would have felt sincere if she hadn't immediately pivoted back to their financial situation. She brought up all the sacrifices she made as a single mom when I was younger, how hard she worked to give me a good life, and how she didn't understand why I was being so cold to them now. It was the same song and dance. What she conveniently left out, though, was how all those sacrifices seemed to stop once Rick came into the picture. Suddenly, it was like I didn't exist unless Rick needed someone to yell at or blame for something. I didn't say much during the call. I let her talk and ended the conversation when she started repeating herself. A few days later, she dropped another bomb. She mentioned that she had also asked my younger half-siblings, her kids with Rick, for help. Apparently, they couldn't chip in because they were both in college and struggling to get by themselves. She said it almost like a guilt trip, as if to say, they're too young, so it's up to you. That wasn't all. My aunt and grandmother started reaching out to me, both repeating the same narrative. My mom had called them, telling them about how I was refusing to help and letting my family fall apart. They both urged me to reconsider, saying things like be the bigger person and your mom needs you. My grandmother was especially persistent, but I could tell she didn't have the full story. When I tried to explain, it felt like she didn't want to hear it. At this point, I knew I needed outside perspective, so I updated my Reddit post. I laid everything out, the texts, the phone calls, the involvement of my extended family. The response was overwhelming. The post blew up, with thousands of comments from people who had been in similar situations or just wanted to offer support. A lot of people warned me to be careful about giving them access to my finances. They said things like co-signing loans or giving them direct cash could turn into a nightmare if they mismanaged it. Others encouraged me to stand firm and set boundaries before things spiraled further. My mom didn't ease up, though. Over the next few weeks, she started texting me almost every day. Some messages were apologetic, promising that she and Rick would pay me back if I just helped them out this one time. Other times, they were full of guilt tripping, bringing up my childhood and how much she had done for me. It was exhausting. I decided to book a session with a therapist to get some professional advice. I needed help processing everything, my resentment, my guilt, and how to handle this situation without losing my sanity. The therapist was great. They helped me understand that I wasn't responsible for fixing my mom and Rick's problems, especially after the way they treated me in the past. They also gave me strategies for setting and maintaining boundaries, which I knew I would need going forward. Around this time, my mom made a new offer. She begged me to at least cover their mortgage for a few months. She said they'd sell the house if they had to, but they needed more time to figure things out. She claimed they'd repay me once Rick found a job. Something about the way she framed it felt off, though, so I decided to dig a little deeper before making any decisions. Reddit had been a lifesaver so far, so I turned to the comments for advice again. A lot of people suggested I look into their financial situation to see if there was more going on than my mom was letting on. It didn't take long for the truth to come out. Through a mutual acquaintance, I learned that Rick had been gambling heavily for years. He hadn't just lost his job, he'd blown through a significant chunk of their savings trying to win it back. That was why they were in such a deep financial hole. The downsizing story was only part of the truth. When I confronted my mom about it, she denied it at first. She tried to downplay it, saying Rick was working on it and attending counseling. But the damage was already done. It was clear their financial problems weren't just bad luck. They were the result of years of poor decisions and mismanagement. Knowing this only strengthened my resolve. There was no way I was going to hand over my hard-earned money to bail them out of a mess they had created. This was far from over, but at least now I had all the pieces of the puzzle. Update 3. Once I found out about Rick's gambling, I couldn't let it slide. I called my mom to confront her about it. I didn't tiptoe around the issue. I laid out exactly what I had learned and where I got the information. At first, she tried to play dumb, acting like she had no idea what I was talking about. She insisted their financial problems were solely due to Rick losing his job and the rising cost of living. But the more I pressed, the shakier her excuses became. I asked for transparency. If she and Rick expected me to help, I wanted to see proof of their situation, bank statements, overdue bills, anything that could show me exactly what they were dealing with. That's when Rick entered the conversation, and it went downhill fast. He was furious. He accused me of invading their privacy, acting like a know-it-all, and trying to humiliate them. It turned into a shouting match with him trying to paint me as the bad guy for even asking. Not long after that call, I started getting more messages from extended family. My mom and Rick had clearly been busy. They reached out to my aunt and other relatives, spinning the story to make it seem like I was being cruel and refusing to help them in their time of need. They framed my request for transparency as me trying to shame them and made it sound like I was using my financial success to hold power over them. It didn't take long for the guilt-tripping calls to start. My aunt told me I was being unreasonable, and a couple of cousins chimed in, urging me to just help and move on. Thankfully, my grandmother had a different perspective. She called me privately to let me know that she supported my decision and that this wasn't the first time Julia and Rick had run into financial trouble. She revealed that she had lent them money in the past, a substantial amount which they never repaid. Apparently, they'd promised her the same thing they were promising me, that they'd pay her back once Rick found a job. She told me I was right to ask questions and warned me not to let them drag me into their mess. Armed with this information, I circled back to my mom. This time, she admitted that Rick had a gambling problem. She said he had been attending counseling and was trying to get better, but she downplayed how bad it really was. Then came another revelation. Their house was at risk of foreclosure. She blamed Rick's inability to manage their savings and his ongoing unemployment, saying they were behind on the mortgage and didn't know how much longer they could hold on. She didn't stop there. She ramped up the guilt trips, telling me that if I refused to help, they might lose their home and have nowhere to go. She tried to frame it as a life or death situation, saying she didn't know how they'd survive without some kind of financial lifeline. The pressure was relentless, but I couldn't ignore the glaring fact that they'd gotten themselves into this situation through years of poor decisions. I updated my Reddit post with everything that had happened so far, including the revelations about Rick's gambling and the looming foreclosure. The response was overwhelming again, with thousands of comments offering support and advice. A few legal experts chimed in, warning me not to get involved financially and suggesting I stick to non-monetary help if I wanted to assist at all. Many commenters echoed my grandmother's warning, saying this situation had all the red flags of financial manipulation. Taking their advice, I decided to offer a compromise. I told my mom I would pay for a financial advisor or credit counselor to help them restructure their debt and come up with a plan to stabilize their finances. It wasn't the solution she wanted, but I thought it was a fair middle ground. She didn't see it that way. She dismissed the idea outright, saying they needed immediate cash, not wasted money on advice. She kept circling back to the mortgage, insisting that just a few months' worth of payments would give them enough time to figure things out. It was clear she wasn't interested in addressing the root of their problems. She just wanted a quick fix. By this point, I was drained. I felt like I was being pulled in every direction, torn between the lingering love I had for my mom and the resentment I'd carried for years. But I knew I couldn't let guilt dictate my actions. I reiterated my boundaries. I wouldn't give them money directly, and I strongly suggested they consider selling their house to downsize if they needed a financial reset. It wasn't what they wanted to hear, but it was the best I could offer. That seemed to be the breaking point for my mom. She ended the conversation abruptly, and I haven't heard from her since. For now, it feels like the storm has passed, but I can't shake the feeling that this isn't over. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that Rick and my mom aren't the type to give up easily. Update 4. The fallout started almost immediately after my last conversation with my mom. Julia and Rick didn't take my refusal well and decided to air their grievances to anyone who would listen. They started spreading stories within the family, painting me as a heartless son who had abandoned his struggling mother out of spite. According to them, I was punishing them for mistakes they made years ago, refusing to forgive, and reveling in their misery. It didn't take long for this narrative to reach my younger half-siblings. They both reached out, confused and upset, asking why I wasn't willing to help during such a dire situation. They told me our mom had shared how desperate things were, and that she was heartbroken I had turned my back on them. They didn't understand the full story, so I took the time to explain everything, from getting kicked out at 18 to discovering Rick's gambling problem and their refusal to accept any accountability. By the end of our conversations, their tone shifted. They admitted they hadn't known about the gambling or the full extent of what had happened between me and our mom. While they didn't outright take my side, they seemed to see things in a different light. Around this time, a family friend reached out with another revelation. Rick was still gambling. Despite claiming he was in counseling and working to fix his addiction, he hadn't stopped. The friend had seen him at a local casino more than once in the past month. This news didn't surprise me, but it confirmed what I had suspected all along, that Rick wasn't making any real effort to change. He was doubling down on the behavior that had landed them in this mess. Then came the next desperate move. My mom reached out again, this time asking for one last loan. She promised they would pay me back with interest once they sold the house, framing it as their only chance to avoid total financial ruin. She pleaded with me to just help this one time, acting like it was a simple favor. But by now, I'd heard enough. I reminded her of all the times she had prioritized Rick over me, of the years I spent struggling on my own while they refused to help. I pointed out that this entire mess was a direct result of Rick's actions and their refusal to take accountability. That conversation didn't go over well. Not long after, Rick called me directly. He was furious, shouting about how I was ungrateful and selfish, claiming I was the reason they were in this situation. He accused me of being a terrible son and said I had no right to judge him or their choices. I didn't let him get far before hanging up and blocking his number. It was clear he wasn't interested in taking responsibility for anything. He just wanted someone to blame. As expected, this only added fuel to the fire. A few extended family members stopped speaking to me entirely, buying into Julia's version of events. They called me heartless and accused me of abandoning my poor mother in her time of need. I didn't bother trying to change their minds. If they wanted to believe her story without hearing mine, that was their choice. On the flip side, my grandmother and a few other relatives became some of my biggest supporters. My grandmother called to tell me how proud she was of me for standing my ground. She knew exactly how manipulative Julia and Rick could be and urged me to keep prioritizing my well-being. Hearing her support meant more than I realized, especially with so much pressure coming from other parts of the family. One day, I decided to dig a little deeper into Rick's supposed job search. Julia had claimed he was actively looking for work, but something didn't add up. A quick search on LinkedIn revealed he hadn't updated his profile in years and hadn't applied to any jobs publicly. It was just another lie to add to the pile. Throughout all of this, therapy continued to be a lifeline. My therapist helped me process the guilt and resentment I'd been carrying for years. They encouraged me to focus on my personal growth and reminded me that I wasn't responsible for fixing my mom and Rick's mistakes. Little by little, I began to let go of the hope that my mom might one day prioritize me over her husband. I shared another update on Reddit, detailing the latest developments, including Rick's continued gambling and the family's attempts to guilt-trip me. The response was overwhelmingly supportive, with people encouraging me to stay firm in my boundaries. Many pointed out that helping now would only enable their behavior and likely lead to even more demands down the line. After my final refusal, Julia went silent. She stopped calling, texting, or reaching out through other family members. For the first time in weeks, there was no new drama to deal with. While part of me wondered what her next move would be, I also felt a strange sense of relief. For now, at least, the storm seemed to have passed. Update 5. A few weeks after my mom went silent, I got an update from my grandmother. She called to let me know that Julia and Rick had sold their house. They didn't tell her much about the details, but she mentioned they'd moved in with one of Rick's cousins temporarily. It seemed like a last-ditch effort to keep a roof over their heads while they figured out their next steps. True to form, my mom didn't reach out to tell me about the move. There was no update, no explanation, no attempt to reconnect. She continued the radio silence, which at this point didn't surprise me. However, she did find another way to make her feelings known, through Facebook. Her profile suddenly became filled with cryptic posts about family abandoning family and learning who really cares about you in tough times. She never named names, but it was clear these were aimed at me. A few relatives even tagged me in comments, trying to drag me into the drama publicly. I ignored it all. Rick, however, wasn't content with passive-aggressive Facebook posts. He found a way to contact me using a new number and left a long, angry voicemail. In it, he accused me of ruining their lives, calling me selfish, ungrateful, and a failure as a son. He went on about how my refusal to help had forced them to sell the house, and how I'd turned my back on my mother. The rant was unhinged, and it was clear he was just lashing out because I wouldn't enable him. I blocked the new number immediately. Around this time, my half-siblings reached out again. After taking some time to process everything I had shared with them, they admitted they'd been too quick to judge me earlier. They apologized for doubting me and even expressed frustration with our parents' choices. They told me how stressful it had been growing up in a household where Rick's decisions always took precedence, and they were tired of being caught in the middle of the drama. It was the first time we'd really connected in years, and it felt like a step forward in repairing our relationship. Despite all the chaos, it seemed like Julia and Rick's financial situation had stabilized somewhat, at least for the time being. My grandmother mentioned that the sale of their house had given them a bit of breathing room. Still, I doubted it would last. Without any significant changes to their spending habits or Rick's gambling, I knew it was only a matter of time before they were back in the same position. Then, out of nowhere, Julia sent me an email. It was long and emotional, starting with an apology for some of the mistakes she had made in the past. She acknowledged that she hadn't always been there for me the way she should have, and that she regretted how things had turned out between us. For a moment, it felt like she was genuinely trying to make amends. But as I read on, it became clear that this wasn't just an apology, it was also another ask. She mentioned that they were still struggling and hinted that even a small contribution from me could make a big difference. I took my time crafting a response. In my reply, I told her that I loved her and would always care about her, but I also reiterated my boundaries. I explained that I couldn't provide financial support, and that it wouldn't be healthy for me to continue enabling a situation that they needed to take responsibility for. I emphasized that this wasn't about punishment or revenge, it was about protecting myself and refusing to be drawn into their pattern of poor decisions. After I sent the email, I didn't hear back. Julia didn't reply, and she didn't call. The silence was loud, but this time it didn't weigh on me as heavily. For the first time in years, I felt at peace with the way things had turned out. I had done everything I could to maintain my integrity and set clear boundaries. Whether or not my mom chose to accept, that was out of my control. I started focusing on myself more, my career, my hobbies, and my therapy. I even began reconnecting with relatives who had supported me through all of this, strengthening relationships outside of my immediate family. These connections felt genuine, free from the manipulation and guilt tripping I had grown so used to. I posted one final update on Reddit, sharing everything that had happened since my last post. The response was overwhelmingly positive. People thanked me for sharing my journey and told me how much they related to my story. Many said it had inspired them to set boundaries in their own lives, which was more than I could have hoped for. Life has moved on since then. Julia remains distant, and Rick is still blocked on every platform. I don't know if things will ever change between us, but I've made my peace with that. For now, I'm focusing on living my life and prioritizing my own happiness and independence. If there's one thing this experience has taught me, it's the importance of valuing yourself enough to walk away from toxic relationships, even when they involve family.